Portami il conto. Isabella froze, mid-step, the wine bottle tilting dangerously in her grip. The man at table 7 had not looked up from his phone. Dark suit, cold eyes. The kind of stillness that made every other sound in the room feel too loud. He had spoken Italian. Perfect Roman dialect Italian. And every server on the floor had pretended not to hear. Isabella set down the bottle, straightened her spine, and answered him fluently, precisely, without a single tremor in her voice. That was the moment Alessandro Moretti finally looked up. That was the moment everything changed. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Isabella's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Isabella Romano had 3 rules. She followed every single night she walked through the doors of Vittorio's. Keep your head down. Move fast. And never under any circumstances let anyone know you understood every word they were saying. Those 3 rules had kept her employed for 2 years. They had kept her invisible, which in a place like Vittorio's was the safest thing a person could be. Because Vittorio's was not just a restaurant. It was a stage. And the people who sat at those white linen tables were not just customers. They were performers, powerful, dangerous, and completely uninterested in anyone who carried their plates. Isabella understood that. She had learned it the hard way. The night was already moving fast when she arrived for her shift. The hostess, a woman named Diane, who wore too much perfume and not enough patience, handed her a section assignment without even looking up. Section 4. Full house tonight. Mr. Caruso already called ahead about the private booth. Nobody goes near it without a manager escort. Isabella took the section card. Which booth? 7. Diane finally looked up and something unreadable crossed her face. Just stay professional and stay fast. These are not the kind of people who like waiting. Isabella nodded and moved toward the floor. She already knew about table 7. Everybody at Vittorio's knew about table 7. It was the table tucked against the far wall, slightly elevated, angled, so that whoever sat there could see every entrance and exit without being seen themselves until they chose to be. It was the table where reservations were never listed by name, where the wine was always opened before the guests arrived, where the waitstaff was selected specifically, and where twice in the past year Isabella had watched managers physically redirect servers who wandered too close. It was the table where serious men ate serious meals and discussed things that were never written down. Isabella kept her eyes forward and started her rounds. Table 9 wanted a second breadbasket. Table 12 had a birthday and needed a candle for their dessert. Table 11 wanted to know if the gnocchi was made in-house. It was, and Isabella knew exactly how, because she had spent a lunch break 2 weeks ago talking to the sous chef in the kitchen about his grandmother's recipe. But she was not supposed to know that, so she said she would check, and came back 3 minutes later with the answer she had already known. That was how the job worked. Know everything, reveal nothing, smile. She was refilling the water glasses at table 8 when she heard it. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady and low, like a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Portami il conto. Bring me the bill. Isabella's hand tightened on the water pitcher. She turned her head just slightly, the way she had trained herself to do, enough to see without appearing to look. The man at table 7 had his phone face down on the table, and his eyes directed somewhere above it, not quite at anything, the way people looked when they were thinking rather than seeing. He was alone in the booth, which was unusual. There were 2 men standing near the far wall, not eating, not drinking, just standing. And Isabella understood what that meant, even if she had spent her whole adult life pretending she didn't. He was waiting for the check. He had asked for it in Italian, and not a single server on the floor had moved. Isabella watched for a full 5 seconds. She counted them deliberately. 5 seconds in a busy restaurant was a long time, and in those 5 seconds, 3 different servers found reasons to turn their backs to table 7. She understood why. She also understood something else. When a man at a table asks for the check, someone has to bring it. She set down the water pitcher. The floor manager, a man named Gerald, who wore his authority like a second skin, appeared from nowhere and touched her elbow with 2 fingers. Romano. She turned. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were doing something complicated. I need you to run the check to 7. I'm not assigned to 7. Maria called in sick. You're the only one who's Italian. He stopped, pressed his lips together. Just run it professionally and come straight back. Don't engage. Don't ask questions. Do not linger. Isabella studied his face. Gerald, how many people at this restaurant know I speak Italian? He blinked. What? You almost said it just now. My Italian. How long have you known? He looked away first. 8 months. You forget I was working the floor the night you helped those tourists near the bar. He straightened his jacket. I kept it quiet because you obviously wanted it quiet. But tonight I need it. Are you going to help me or not? She looked at table 7. The man had not moved. He still wasn't looking at anyone. But there was something in the quality of his stillness that made her think he was aware of every single thing happening around him. I'll run the check, as she said. Don't engage. You already said that. She picked up the leather check presenter from Gerald's hand and walked toward table 7. She was 12 feet away when the man finally moved. He picked up his phone, checked something on the screen, set it back down face first. She was 8 feet away when one of the standing men near the wall shifted his weight. She was 5 feet away when the man at the table said without turning his head, Finalmente, finally. Isabella did not stop walking. She reached the table, set the check presenter down on the right side with both hands, and said in clean, unaccented Italian, My apologies for the delay, sir. Your server wasn't available. Is there anything else I can bring you before you go? The silence that followed was exactly 4 seconds long. She counted those 2. Then the man turned his head and looked at her for the first time. Alessandro Moretti had eyes the color of deep water, not blue, not gray, but somewhere between the two, and when he looked at something, he looked at all of it. Not just the surface, all of it. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that doesn't fit the picture they expected. Parli Italiano. You speak Italian. Si. Yes. Da dove. From where? My grandparents were from Palermo, she said, staying in Italian, keeping her voice steady. They made sure I learned before I learned anything else. He studied her face. And you've been working here how long? 2 years. In section 4. She hadn't told him that. She felt the back of her neck tighten, but she kept her expression professional. Yes. And you've never once worked this table? I'm not assigned to this table. But you understood everything said here tonight. It was not a question. Isabella held his gaze and said nothing. Alessandro Moretti was quiet for a moment. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. What's your name? Isabella. Isabella. He said it the Italian way, all 4 syllables present and unhurried. Bella. He picked up the check presenter without opening it and held it out to her. There's no bill tonight. Tell Gerald to put it on my account. He already did, sir. Then why did he send you over here with an empty folder? Isabella looked at the check presenter in her hand. Her stomach dropped exactly 1 inch, then she recovered. I imagine he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Or he wanted to see what would happen. Alessandro tilted his head slightly. Smart man Gerald. She set the empty folder back on the table because there was nothing else to do with it and said, Enjoy your evening, sir. She turned to walk away. Isabella. She stopped. You didn't even flinch. His voice was still low, still steady. Most people flinch. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Most people haven't spent 2 years learning which tables to avoid. She walked back towards section 4. She did not look back a second time, but she felt his eyes on her back every single step of the way. That was a Thursday night. By Saturday, Isabella had convinced herself it meant nothing. Men in expensive suits said things that sounded meaningful and weren't. That was the first lesson she had learned at Vittorio's, and she had no reason to unlearn it on the basis of one 60-second conversation. She had more important things to think about anyway. Her rent was 3 weeks away, and she was already doing the math on which bills to pay first. Her law school application for the spring semester was sitting on her kitchen table, with 2 sections still incomplete. Her landlord had left a voicemail about a rent increase she was not prepared for. Isabella Romano did not have the luxury of being rattled by interesting men. She worked her Saturday shift without incident. She worked Sunday lunch the same way. Monday she came in early to pick up a double shift because Carla had a family emergency and nobody else had volunteered. She was rolling silverware in the side station at 5:30, when Gerald appeared in the doorway with a look on his face she had not seen before. "Isabella." "I'm not done with the silverware." "Leave it." He stepped aside from the doorway and gestured for her to come. "Someone wants to speak with you." She set down the fork she was holding. "A customer." "Not exactly." She followed him through the kitchen, past the prep stations, past the walk-in cooler down the narrow hallway that led to the restaurant's back offices. The hallway smelled like garlic and bleach, and the particular kind of old wood that came from buildings that had been renovated over renovations, without ever quite losing their original bones. Gerald stopped outside the office at the end of the hall. He knocked twice. A voice on the other side said, "Come in." Gerald opened the door and then, without entering himself, stepped back to let Isabella through. She walked in. The office was larger than she expected. A real desk, real bookshelves, a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, currently dark. 2 chairs facing the desk, both empty. A lamp throwing warm light from the corner. Alessandro Moretti was standing near the window with his back to her, and his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. He heard the door close behind her. He turned. "You came," he said. "Gerald didn't tell me I had a choice." "You always have a choice." He moved to one of the chairs and sat, then gestured to the one across from him. Not to the chair behind the desk, to the one beside it. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Not rudely, more the way someone looked when they were deciding how much truth to start with. "You know who I am," he said. "I know your name." "That's not what I asked." Isabella folded her hands in her lap. "I know what people say about you." "What do people say?" "That you run things." She kept her voice level. "That you've run things in this city for a long time. That Vittorio's has your name on the deed under 4 different holding companies. That the reason nobody in Section 4 ever looks at Table 7 is because someone at some point made a very clear example of what happens when they do." Alessandro was quiet. "I'm not trying to be rude," she added. "You asked what people say." "No." A pause. "I asked what you know." She looked at him steadily. "I know that you came back on Friday night, and again on Saturday. I know you sat in a different section each time. And I know Gerald was watching you watch me, because Gerald watches everything, and he had the expression he gets when he's trying to figure out which way a situation is going to fall." The corner of Alessandro's mouth moved. That same, almost smile. "And which way did you decide it was going to fall?" "I hadn't decided yet," she said. "I was still gathering information." He was quiet for another moment. Then he sat back, and something in his posture shifted, not quite relaxed, but less carefully composed. "I want to offer you a job," he said. Isabella did not respond immediately. She had learned early in her graduate studies that silence was not emptiness. Silence was information. The way a person handled silence told you almost everything about what they valued. Alessandro Moretti let her have the silence without filling it. That was the first thing that surprised her. "What kind of job?" she said finally. "My business operations extend across several countries, Italy primarily, but also parts of France, Spain, and Greece. I manage significant investments in real estate, hospitality, and import." He said it the way someone said something that was partly true. "The people I work with speak in formal Italian that doesn't always reflect what they actually mean. Cultural nuance, subtext, regional dialect differences that change the meaning of agreements. You want a translator? I want someone who understands the difference between what someone says and what they intend." He paused. "I've had translators. They give me the words. You gave me something different in 60 seconds. I asked if you needed anything before you left. You read the room before you walked in," he said. You read me before you spoke. You knew exactly what register to use, what posture to take, when to hold ground, and when to give it. He leaned forward slightly. Where did you learn that? My grandmother, she said before she could stop herself. He waited. She hadn't meant to say more, but something about the directness of his attention made deflection feel like dishonesty, and she had never been comfortable being dishonest. She used to say that language was architecture, that every conversation was a building, and if you wanted to know what was really being constructed, you had to look at the load-bearing walls, not the decoration. She stopped. She would have been embarrassed by that metaphor. She was a practical woman. She sounds like someone who survived difficult things, Alessandro said. She did. So did you. It was quiet. The offer, Isabella said. Specifics. He named a salary. She kept her face still and her breathing even, which took more effort than she would have liked, because the number he named was more than 3 times what she was making at Vittorio's, and would have covered her rent, her student loans, and her law school application fees, with enough left over to feel like breathing room for the first time in 2 years. The role is personal advisor and cultural liaison, he said. You would travel with me to meetings. You would sit in on negotiations. You would tell me afterward what I missed. He paused. And occasionally, if the situation required it, you would speak. To whom? To whoever needed to be spoken to. He met her eyes. Nothing illegal. Nothing that would compromise your law school application or your future. My businesses are complex, but they are businesses. Isabella looked at him carefully. That's a very precise thing to volunteer. I know what you're thinking about. You don't know me. No, he agreed. But I know what a person looks like when they're trying to decide if they can afford to say no. He sat back again. You can. If you say no, you walk back out to Section 4. Gerald doesn't mention this meeting to anyone. Nothing changes. And if I say yes, then a great many things change. She was quiet for a moment. I have conditions. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like the careful attention of someone who had just become more interested. Go ahead. I finish my law school application. Whatever the schedule becomes, I have protected time to do that. Agreed. I'm not on call. If you need me for a meeting, you give me 48 hours notice, unless there's a genuine emergency, and I'm the one who decides what qualifies as an emergency. A pause. Then, agreed. I don't sign anything that asks me to keep secrets about illegal activity. If I'm ever in a room where something crosses a line, I walk out, without consequences. He held her gaze for a long moment. Agreed. And I need you to understand something very clearly. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, because her grandmother had also taught her that the person who controlled proximity controlled the conversation. I am not a possession. I am not a symbol. I am not a demonstration of anything you want to show other people. If at any point this job becomes about what I represent rather than what I can actually do, I leave. And I won't be the one who looks foolish. The silence this time was different from all the others. Alessandro Moretti looked at her with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Not admiration exactly. Not calculation. Something quieter and more careful than either. I understand, he said. She held his gaze a moment longer. Then she sat back. I'll need the details in writing, she said. Not a contract, a letter. Clear language, no legal ambiguity. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. She stood. He stood. Isabella. He said it the way he had before, all 4 syllables, nothing rushed. I want to ask you something that isn't part of the offer. You can refuse to answer. She waited. Why did you answer me on Thursday? Everyone else on the floor had decided not to hear me. You could have done the same. She thought about it. The honest answer, not the safe one. Because someone spoke to you in your own language and nobody answered, she said. And I know what that feels like. She left the office. She walked back through the hallway, past the walk-in cooler, past the prep stations, out through the kitchen, and onto the floor of Vittorio's. And she finished rolling silverware until her shift ended. She did not tell anyone what had happened. But for the first time in 2 years, she rolled the silverware without keeping count of how many shifts she needed to cover her rent. The letter arrived the following morning. Not by email. By hand, delivered to the door of her apartment by a man in a dark coat who handed her a sealed envelope, said, "Good morning," and left. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and opened it. The language was exactly what she had asked for, clear, direct, no ambiguity. The salary. The notice requirements. The scope of work. A clause she had not asked for, but noted. Ms. Romano retains the right to withdraw from any engagement at her sole discretion without penalty or obligation. At the bottom of the letter below the signature, there was a single handwritten line. The woman who answers when everyone else decides not to hear is exactly the kind of person I need. A.M. Isabella read it twice. She folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it next to her law school application on the kitchen table. She picked up the application. She spent the next 2 hours finishing the remaining 2 sections which had been blank for 6 weeks. Then she picked up her phone and called the number on the letter. A man answered. Not Alessandro. Someone professional, efficient. Miss Romano. Tell him I accept, she said. She hung up. She looked at her completed law school application. She had spent 2 years at Vittorio's becoming invisible. Starting now, she was going to become something else entirely. She just hadn't decided yet exactly what that was. But she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, not quite arrived, but coming. Closer, every minute. Her first day working for Alessandro Moretti began not in an office, but in a car. A black car, comfortable and quiet, that arrived at her building at 7 in the morning and waited at the curb without honking. She came down at 7:02 because she refused to be waiting at the window, and she was grateful the driver said nothing about the 2 minutes. Alessandro was already in the back seat. He looked up from a folder of papers when she got in. Gave her exactly 1 second of assessment the way she was beginning to understand was simply his way of seeing things, and said, "Good morning." "Good morning." She settled into her seat and looked forward. The car moved. "We're going to a breakfast meeting," he said. "Salvatore De Luca. He's a business partner from Florence. We've been negotiating the terms of a joint property acquisition for 3 months. He paused. "Salvatore has agreed in principle to everything on paper, but he's been introducing small delays, reasons to wait, reasons to revisit. He's not sure he wants to proceed." Alessandro glanced at her. "Yes." "Why?" "That's what I need you to find out." She looked at him. "You haven't asked him directly." "I've asked him directly 4 times. He reassures me." "And you don't believe the reassurance?" "I believe he means it when he says it," Alessandro said carefully. "But something is making him hesitate, and whatever that something is, it's not in any of the papers we've exchanged." Isabella thought about that. "Does he know I'm coming?" "He knows I'm bringing an advisor." "Does he know I speak Italian?" Alessandro looked at her again, and this time there was something deliberate in his expression. "No." She understood. "All right. If he says anything to his associate, a man named Enzo, who will also be there, that he doesn't intend me to understand, you'll tell me afterward. And if he says something he doesn't intend either of us to understand, then you'll tell me anyway, and we'll discuss what to do with it." She nodded. "What's the property?" "A hotel in the Amalfi Coast, historic building. Significantly undervalued due to a complicated ownership history." "How complicated?" Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "There was a family dispute, several decades ago. The original owners had children by 2 different marriages. The legal title has been contested intermittently ever since. And Salvatore's hesitation might be connected to the family dispute." "It might. Or it might be something else entirely." "Yes." She looked out the window at the city moving past. "You're not sure which, and you need someone to listen in a way that goes past the words." "Correct. And you couldn't ask any of your regular people to do this because everyone Salvatore has ever met in my organization has a role he already understands," Alessandro said. "He knows how to manage them. He doesn't know how to manage you." He paused. "That's an advantage. It won't last. I'd like to use it while it exists. Isabella looked back at him. That's very honest. You said you needed clear language. She almost smiled. I did. The car slowed. They were pulling up to a hotel with a polished brass entrance. A man was already standing outside watching the car approach. Medium height, silver hair. The kind of easy, expensive tailoring that meant old money rather than new. Salvatore De Luca. Beside him, slightly younger, slightly less certain Enzo. Ready, Alessandro said quietly. Tell me one thing first, Isabella said. What do you do if I find out the problem is something you don't want to hear? Alessandro held her gaze. I listen anyway. She reached for the door handle. That's the right answer, she said. And she stepped out into the morning. The breakfast meeting lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. Isabella said very little in the first 40 minutes. She was introduced as a cultural advisor, which was accurate as far as it went. And Salvatore received this information with the particular smile of a man who was deciding how seriously to take something. He tested her immediately. Not obviously. Just a comment to Enzo, voice low and relaxed, Italian spoken. The way people spoke it when they assumed the room wasn't following something about the quality of American business practices, and how they always imported the appearance of culture rather than the substance. Isabella looked at her coffee cup. She did not react. Enzo responded with something gentle about being cautious regardless. Alessandro watched both of them, and Isabella could see from the angle of his attention that he was aware something had been said and was waiting. She let it sit. 20 minutes later, Salvatore mentioned the Amalfi property for the first time. He used the word complicated 3 times in a single paragraph, which in Isabella's experience was a person's way of saying there was something specific they were carefully not naming. She leaned forward slightly. Signor De Luca, she said in Italian, and watched his face change, not dramatically, but the way a room changes when a window is suddenly open. You've used the word complicato several times. In my experience, that word means different things depending on the family. For some people it means legal complexity. For others it means something more personal. She kept her voice gentle. Is there something about this property that has weight for you beyond the business terms? Enzo looked at Salvatore. Salvatore looked at Isabella. Then he looked at Alessandro. Alessandro said nothing. He waited. And Salvatore De Luca, for the first time in 4 months of negotiations, told the truth. The property had belonged partially to his wife's family. Decades ago, before the dispute, before the courts. There was a piece of the original ownership that had never been formally resolved, and proceeding with the acquisition meant either acknowledging that piece publicly or burying it permanently, and his wife had not yet told him which she could live with. It was not a legal problem. It was a marriage. He had been too proud to say so to Alessandro directly. After he finished speaking, Salvatore sat very still, the way people sat when they had said more than they planned and were recalibrating. Isabella said quietly, "Thank you for telling us." She did not look at Alessandro. She kept her eyes on Salvatore. This kind of complication deserves more time than the papers allow. Would it help to pause the formal timeline for 3 weeks? Salvatore's jaw unclenched. It would. She looked at Alessandro then. Alessandro picked up his coffee cup and said simply, 3 weeks. The meeting ended cordially. Handshakes, small talk. The easy movement of people who had successfully navigated something difficult. When they were back in the car, Alessandro was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I never would have gotten that." "You might have," she said. "No." He shook his head once. "I would have pushed harder on the legal complexity, because that's what I expected the problem to be." He looked at her. "You asked about the weight. My grandmother used to say that business problems are rarely about business." She was right. He looked out the window. "What made you offer the 3 weeks?" He needed to feel like the decision was still his. She settled back in her seat. "If you had offered it, it would have felt like concession. If I offered it, it was just a door." Alessandro nodded slowly. "Isabella." "Yes." "This is going to be more complicated than I made it sound in that letter." She already knew that. She had known it before she got in the car. I know. Are you going to regret saying yes? She thought about her law school application completed and submitted now. She thought about her rent covered. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that language was architecture, and that the most important buildings were the ones built on truth. Ask me in 6 months, she said. Alessandro looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the window. Fair enough, he said. The car moved through the city, and Isabella Romano, who had spent 2 years becoming invisible, began to understand that she had just stepped into a world where no one was invisible, not for long, and not without a cost. She did not look away from that understanding. She had never been the kind of person who could. The 3 weeks. Alessandro gave Salvatore De Luca passed the way. Weeks passed when something important was quietly building underneath the surface of ordinary days. Fast on the outside, slow on the inside, and charged with the particular tension of waiting for a thing you couldn't name yet. Isabella spent those weeks learning the architecture of Alessandro's world, not the version that appeared in newspapers, and not the version that lived in rumors. The actual architecture, the way his days were structured, the people who moved through them, the rhythms and silences that told you more about a man than any conversation. She was not sentimental about what she found. Alessandro Moretti operated the way a city operated through systems that most people never thought about until they stopped working. He had legal businesses that were genuine businesses, run by people who showed up every morning with coffee and spreadsheets and genuine anxiety about quarterly returns. He had properties across 3 continents managed by a small team of analysts who worked in a building in Midtown and probably didn't know or didn't ask where the original capital came from. And then there was the other part. The part that lived in phone calls that happened at odd hours. In meetings that were never written on any calendar. In the way certain men looked at Alessandro when he entered a room, not the way employees looked at a boss, but the way people looked at someone who had at some point made a decision that changed the course of something, and everyone in the room knew it. Isabella saw all of it. She did not pretend she didn't. But she also did not allow herself to be afraid of it, because fear was a form of blindness, and blindness was the one thing she could not afford. Her office, if you could call it that, was a desk in the corner of a large room on the 14th floor of a building on 5th Avenue that Alessandro used as a base of operations. It was a real desk, good wood, and someone had placed a lamp on it that gave warm light rather than the flat overhead kind, which she appreciated more than she expected to. On her 3rd morning, she arrived to find a stack of files on her desk and a yellow sticky note on top that read in handwriting that was precise and unsentimental. Background on the Italian accounts. What am I missing? She sat down, poured coffee from the carafe on the credenza, and started reading. 4 hours later, she walked down the hall and knocked on Alessandro's door. He looked up. You're missing 2 things, she said. He put down his pen. Tell me. The Fontana account in Genoa. She set one of the files on his desk. The primary contact is listed as Marco Fontana, but every correspondence for the last 18 months has been signed by someone named Giulia. No last name given. Just Giulia. She paused. In Genoese business culture, a woman signing correspondence under one name without a title usually means she's family. Unmarried daughter, probably. And if she's been running the communications for a 1.5 years without anyone formally acknowledging her role, she's either being deliberately kept off the official record, or she doesn't know she should be on it. Alessandro was looking at her steadily. And the second thing, the timing of the Amalfi delays. She set a second file beside the first. The first delay was 3 months ago. You told me negotiations had been ongoing for 3 months before that. But this document, she tapped a page near the back, shows that De Luca's wife's family name appears in the original 1987 property filing. He knew about the family connection before negotiations began. He didn't discover it partway through. The room was very quiet. He came into this knowing, Isabella said. He was always going to need the conversation we had at breakfast. He just needed someone to open the door in the right language. Alessandro leaned back. His expression was controlled, but something moved beneath it, something that looked like a man recalibrating a significant assumption. "Why would he not have simply told me at the beginning?" he said. "Because telling you at the beginning would have meant admitting to a complication before you'd decided the property was worth the complication." She sat down across from him, uninvited, because the moment felt like a moment for sitting, and she trusted that instinct. He needed you already invested first. Then the complication becomes a problem to solve together, rather than a reason to walk away. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant manipulation," he said. "It's also something you would have done," she said. The silence after that was different from all the silences before it. Not hostile, not defensive, just the particular stillness of a person who has been told an accurate thing and is deciding what to do with it. Then Alessandro said very quietly, "Yes, it is." He picked up the file on Giulia Fontana. "What do you recommend?" "Contact Giulia directly. Acknowledge her role formally, even if only in the opening of an email, if she's been managing communications for 18 months without recognition. The acknowledgement alone will tell you more about the account than anything else in that file." He looked at her over the top of the folder. "What will it tell me? Whether she's grateful or resentful?" Isabella stood. "One of those means she's been protecting the relationship. The other means she's been tolerating it. And those two things require completely different approaches." She walked back toward the door. "Isabella." She stopped. "You've been here 3 days." "Yes." "You read 4 months of files in 4 hours." "I read quickly." "That's not what I mean." He set the folder down. "Most people who come into this position spend the first 2 weeks figuring out how not to say the wrong thing. You spent 3 days figuring out what nobody had said at all." He paused. "I want to understand how you do that." She turned around. "My grandmother used to say that most people listen for the answer they expect. If you listen for the answer you don't expect, you hear everything." Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Thank you," he said, simply, without anything extra attached to it. She nodded. She went back to her desk. She did not let herself feel the warmth of that exchange for longer than it took to walk down the hall, because warmth was its own kind of distraction, and she had not come this far by getting distracted. But she felt it. She noticed that she felt it, and she filed that information carefully, the way she filed everything, not ignored, not acted on, just held with precision, until she understood what it meant. The call from Marco Fontana came 11 days later. Not Giulia. Marco. Isabella was at her desk, reviewing a contract translation, when Alessandro appeared in the doorway with his phone already in his hand, and an expression she had learned to read as controlled urgency. "Marco Fontana is on the line," he said. "He wants to discuss the Genoa account. He asked if my cultural consultant would be joining the call." She looked up. "You told him about me." "I contacted Giulia last week, as you suggested." He paused. "She responded within 6 hours. We've had 3 conversations since. Marco found out yesterday." She set down the contract. "Is he angry?" "He's not angry." "Put him on speaker," she said. Alessandro looked at her for 1 second. Then he pressed the button. The voice that came through was the voice of a man in his 60s who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered. Marco Fontana spoke Italian, the way certain people spoke any language they'd been speaking since birth, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never needed to consider how they sounded. Moretti. Just the name. The rest of the sentence was in the weight of how he said it. "Marco," Alessandro said, in English deliberately. "I'm glad you called. Sono sicuro che lo sei." "I'm sure you are." A pause. Then switching to English too slowly, like a man yielding a small point on purpose. "I understand you've been speaking with my daughter." "Giulia has been managing the account communications for 18 months, Alessandro said. "I thought it was appropriate to acknowledge that." "Giulia is not authorized to. She's been doing it anyway," Alessandro said. "Very well from what I can see." Silence. Isabella leaned slightly toward the phone. She said in Italian gently, Signor Fontana, sua figlia, ha protetto questo rapporto con grande cura. Ha risposto entro 6 ore. Ha anticipato ogni domanda. Non ha mai superato I limiti di ciò che le era stato insegnato, ma ha chiaramente imparato bene. Mr. Fontana, your daughter has protected this relationship with great care. She responded within 6 hours. She anticipated every question. She never exceeded the limits of what she was taught, but she has clearly learned well. Another silence. When Marco Fontana spoke again, his voice had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. You speak Italian? Yes, sir. Where did you study? My grandparents were from Palermo. They taught me before I started school. A beat. Palermo. Something in his tone shifted territorial, and then almost imperceptibly warm. My wife's family is from Palermo. Siamo paesani. We are from the same place. In un certo senso. In a way. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Then he said formally back to English. I would like to meet this consultant of yours, Moretti, in person, before the quarter closes. Alessandro looked at Isabella across the desk. She gave him the smallest possible nod. I'll have my office contact yours, Alessandro said. Marco Fontana said goodbye in Italian and hung up. The room was quiet. Paesani, Alessandro said, looking at her. You knew he had a connection to Palermo. It was in the 1994 account history. His wife's maiden name was Sanfilippo. That's a Palermo family name. She picked up the contract she had been reviewing. People from Palermo don't need much more than that. Alessandro shook his head slowly. Not in disagreement. In something that looked a great deal like involuntary respect. 3 weeks, he said. You've been here 3 weeks. 23 days, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The meeting with Marco Fontana in Genoa was scheduled for a Thursday, which meant Isabella had 11 days to prepare, and she used every one of them. She read everything available on the Fontana family's business history, which went back 4 generations and had the particular texture of a family enterprise that had survived multiple historical catastrophes through a combination of strategic marriages, careful allegiances, and the specific Genoese talent for appearing smaller than you were until you needed to be larger. She read Giulia's communications not for content, but for cadence. The way she structured sentences. The formality she maintained even in response to casual questions. The places where her language tightened slightly, which were the places where she was compensating for something. She was compensating. Isabella concluded for the fact that her father didn't know what she was doing, or hadn't until now. She brought that conclusion to Alessandro on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the car on the way back from a meeting with a property lawyer in the Bronx. Giulia has been managing the account without her father's knowledge, she said. Not deceptively. I don't think she set out to deceive him. I think she stepped in during a period when he was unavailable, and she was competent, so the situation continued. Alessandro was looking at a document in his hand. How do you know he was unavailable? There's a gap in the correspondence from late 2023. About 6 weeks where Giulia handles everything, and the responses from the Fontana side are all hers. No mention of Marco. She paused. Giulia mentioned in her second conversation with you that her father had been traveling for health reasons. He looked up. She told you that. She told you. You sent me the transcripts. I sent you those transcripts to review the business content. I reviewed everything. She looked at him steadily. Marco Fontana was ill. Giulia stepped in. She did it well, and she kept the relationship intact during a period when her father may not have been capable of doing it himself. When he recovered, she didn't stop because the work was working. She paused. When you contacted her directly, you didn't just acknowledge her competence. You potentially exposed something she had been managing very carefully. Alessandro set down the document. He was quiet for a moment. Is she in a difficult position? Possibly. Depending on how Marco actually feels about what she did versus how he chose to sound on that phone call. He sounded controlled. He sounded like a father who has very complicated feelings and is choosing to process them privately. She looked out the window. That's actually a good sign. Men who are genuinely angry don't control themselves that well. Or they control themselves extremely well. Yes, she said. Which is why we need to be careful in Genoa. He nodded slowly. What do you recommend? Let him lead the meeting. Don't direct anything toward Julia until he does. And if there's a moment where he acknowledges her contribution. She paused. Let that moment breathe. Don't follow it up with anything. Just let it be what it is. Alessandro looked at her. You're managing 3 relationships simultaneously, he said. Me and Marco and Julia, and the account itself. Yes. How do you keep track of all of it? She thought of her grandmother, of Sunday afternoons in a kitchen that smelled like tomatoes and old wood, learning to listen to 3 conversations at once, because that was how the women in her family had always survived. Practice, she said. Alessandro was quiet for the rest of the drive, but she caught him looking at her twice. She noticed both times. She said nothing. Genoa was cold and gray, in the way that northern Italian cities were cold and gray in November. Not brutal, just settled, the kind of weather that had decided what it was going to do and saw no reason to negotiate. Isabella stepped off the plane and felt for the first time in 23 years the particular quality of Italian air. Not the same as New York, not the same as anything. She had never been to Italy before. She had only ever known it through her grandmother's words, her grandfather's songs, the specific weight of a language learned in a kitchen before she was 5 years old. She thought, walk through the terminal, Nonna, I'm here. She did not say it out loud. They were taken directly to the Fontana offices, which were in a building that had been in the family since the 1930s, and showed it not in disrepair, but in the specific dignity of things that had never needed to perform newness, because they already knew what they were. Marco Fontana met them in a reception room. He was shorter than Isabella had expected, and older, with the particular quality of a man who had once been physically powerful, and now carried that history in his bearing rather than his body. Beside him stood Julia. She was 34-35, dark eyes, the kind of composure that came from years of operating in a room where you were always slightly underpowered. She looked at Isabella with an expression of careful neutrality, and Isabella recognized it immediately because she had worn that expression herself for 2 years in Section 4. I don't know yet if you're safe, the expression said. Isabella nodded at her simply. Something shifted in Julia's face, just slightly. The meeting began. Marco was formal and precise, and covered the business details with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and saw no reason to extend what could be concluded quickly. Alessandro matched his pace. Numbers, timelines, terms. Isabella sat slightly to the side and said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. She watched Marco's hands when he spoke. She watched Julia's eyes when Marco spoke. She noted the 3 moments when Julia had information that Marco was searching for and provided it quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to the provision. The dynamic was unmistakable to anyone looking for it. Julia was running this. Marco was the authority. Julia was the function. And Marco, Isabella realized watching his face when his daughter interjected a figure he had misremembered. Marco knew it. He was not embarrassed by it. He was grateful for it. He just didn't know how to say so in front of other people. The meeting had been running for 1 hour and 10 minutes. When Marco paused, rearranged the papers in front of him, and then said something that had nothing to do with the account. He said in Italian to no one in particular, Mia figlia è brava. My daughter is capable. It was not directed at Julia. It was not directed at Alessandro. It was the statement of a man who had rehearsed saying something in the privacy of his own mind, and then found it coming out at an unexpected moment. Isabella let the moment breathe. She did not follow it up with anything. She counted to 4 in her head. Then Julia said quietly, also in Italian, Grazie, Papa. Thank you, Father. And Marco Fontana looked at his daughter and nodded once, and something in the room settled that had apparently been unsettled for quite some time. Alessandro looked at Isabella. She looked back at him. She had warned him to let the moment breathe, and to his credit he did. He picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and said nothing. The meeting concluded 30 minutes later with a signed agreement on the timeline and a handshake between Marco and Alessandro that had the quality of two men who had just transacted something more than business. In the corridor afterward, while Alessandro was speaking with Marco's lawyer, Julia fell into step beside Isabella. They walked for a moment in silence. Then Julia said in Italian quietly, "He hadn't said that to me before, in front of anyone." "I know," Isabella said. "How?" "Because you looked surprised, and you don't look like someone who surprises easily." Julia was quiet for a step or two. "Thank you," she said, "for whatever it is you did." "I didn't do anything," Isabella said. "I just listened." "That's not nothing," Julia said. "In this business, that's almost everything." Isabella thought of Vittorio's, of 2 years of listening to conversations people assumed she couldn't hear, of the very specific education that came from being the person in the room that no one was watching. "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." They flew back to New York that evening. Alessandro was quiet for the first hour of the flight. Not closed off. His particular quality of quiet that Isabella was beginning to understand was what happened when he was processing something rather than avoiding it. She left him to it. She worked on a contract translation and drank tea and watched the clouds through the window. At hour 2, he said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. She looked up. "International negotiations, partnerships, managing accounts in places where I don't know the language." He looked at the seat back in front of him rather than at her. "I have always hired people who knew the language, translators, advisors, people who could tell me what was said." "Yes." "In 15 years, nobody has ever told me what Marco said to his daughter at the end of that meeting." He paused. "Not because they didn't notice, because they didn't understand why it mattered." Isabella closed the contract she was reviewing. "It mattered," she said, "because that account will be stable now in a way it wasn't 2 hours ago. Not because of the signed agreement, because of one sentence." She paused. "Julia will stay in her role and stay loyal to the relationship because her father finally acknowledged her in front of witnesses. That's worth more than any contractual term you put in writing today." Alessandro finally turned and looked at her. "And you knew that before we walked in?" "I suspected it. I couldn't know for certain until it happened. But you created the conditions for it to happen." "I advised you to let the moment breathe," she said. "You did. That was the condition." He studied her face. "You give me credit I'm not sure I've earned." "You listened," she said. "In my experience, that's rarer than it sounds." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Isabella, I need to tell you something that isn't in any of the documents you've been reviewing." She set down her tea. The shift in his tone was subtle, but she caught it the half-step from professional to something more careful. "All right," she said. "There are people in my world who have noticed you, not because of what you've done, because of what I've changed." He paused. "I don't bring people to meetings. I don't rely on advisors in the room. I haven't in a long time. And when something changes in how I operate, certain people pay attention." She held very still. "I'm not telling you this to alarm you," he said. "I'm telling you because you asked for clarity, and I intend to give it to you." He met her eyes. "Someone reached out to a contact of mine last week, asked questions about who you were, where you came from, what your role was." "Who?" He shook his head once. "Not information I have yet, but I'm looking." "You're telling me I'm a person of interest to someone dangerous. I'm telling you that being close to me comes with a particular visibility. I should have made that clearer at the beginning." Isabella looked at the window for a moment, at the dark clouds and the dark water far below. She thought about her apartment, about her law school application submitted now and waiting, about her grandmother who had survived 2 continents and 3 languages and never once looked away from a difficult truth. She turned back. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Alessandro looked at her, and for the briefest moment, the careful composure of his face did something she had not seen it do before. It shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But she was always paying close attention. "Nothing yet," he said. "But I needed you to know." "Why?" she said. "You could have kept that information and managed it yourself. I wouldn't have known." "No," he said. "You wouldn't have." The silence held. "Alessandro." She said his name for the first time without a formal inflection. Just his name. "Why did you tell me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you were the first person who helped someone without expecting anything back," he said. It was almost exactly what he had said to her in that office at Vittorio's weeks ago. But the weight of it was different now, not an explanation, but something that had moved from the head to somewhere lower and more honest. "And I am not going to be the person," he said quietly, "who doesn't extend you the same." The plane moved through the dark air. Isabella picked up her tea. Her hand was perfectly steady. Inside, something had changed, something small and precise and significant, like the turn of a key in a lock she hadn't known was there. She did not name it, not yet, but she felt it, and she did not look away. They landed at JFK at 11:40 at night. The car was waiting at the curb, as it always was. The driver said nothing, as he always did. Alessandro walked Isabella to the car first, which he had never done before. He usually moved toward his own car, the second one, which waited behind the first, without a second look. Tonight, he stood beside her door until she opened it. She paused with one hand on the frame. "Good work today," he said, simply, without theater. "Good work listening," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Then, "Get some sleep. We have the Riva account brief tomorrow afternoon. I'll have notes ready by noon." She got in. The door closed. The car moved away from the curb. She looked out the window at the lights of the city, the particular dense, blazing, chaotic beauty of New York at midnight, and she thought about a man who had spent 15 years running things alone, deciding for reasons she was still trying to fully understand that she was the person he wanted beside him. She thought about the person who had asked questions about her last week. She thought about what that meant and what it would eventually require. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her Isabella the most dangerous thing you can be in this world is capable. Because capable people attract attention. And attention, my love, is not always friendly. She had known that. She had spent 2 years hiding from it in Section 4. But hiding was finished now. She was visible. She was in. And whatever came next, whatever was moving in the shadows of Alessandro Moretti's world, asking questions about the woman who had appeared at his side, she was going to face it the same way she faced everything. Eyes open, voice steady, and ready to hear what nobody else was listening for. The notes Isabella had promised by noon were on Alessandro's desk by 10:45. She knew this because she had been awake since 5:30, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness that had settled into her system since the flight home from Genoa. The kind of wakefulness that came when your mind understood, even if you hadn't fully articulated it yet, that the terrain had shifted and you needed to pay different attention now. Someone had been asking questions about her. She did not know who. She did not know why specifically, though she could construct several reasonable theories. What she knew was that the questions had started after she began attending meetings with Alessandro, which meant the interest was not in Isabella Romano, the waitress from Section 4. It was in Isabella Romano, the woman standing next to a man that powerful people watched very carefully. She had spent the morning doing what she always did when information was incomplete. She built a framework. She wrote down every meeting she had attended, every person who had been in the room, every account, every name, every conversation she had either participated in or been present for. She noted the ones where her presence had been unexpected. She noted the ones where she had spoken when no one anticipated her speaking. She noted the reactions that had seemed too controlled because in her experience, genuine surprise looked like surprise, and controlled surprise looked like a performance. By the time she had finished, she had a list of 6 names. She did not share the list with Alessandro yet. She wanted to think about it first. That was how she arrived at his office at 10:45 with the Riva account brief and the list folded in her jacket pocket and knocked twice on his door. He opened it himself, which was unusual. His assistant, a quiet, efficient man named Thomas, who communicated primarily through subtle shifts in posture, was not at his desk outside. "Where's Thomas?" she asked. "I gave him the morning." Alessandro stepped back to let her in. "Sit down. I need to tell you something before we get into the Riva brief." She sat. She pulled out the brief but did not open it. He sat across from her, not behind the desk, but in the chair beside it, the way he had sat in that first meeting at Vittorio's, not using the authority of furniture to create distance. "The person who was asking about you," he said. "I have a name." She waited. "Cesare Vantini." The name meant nothing to her. She said so. "He wouldn't," Alessandro said. "He operates primarily in Europe. Milan mostly. He has interests in the same hospitality sector I work in, and we have overlapped several times over the years in ways that were not always comfortable." He paused, and she understood that was a carefully chosen word. "He's not someone I would describe as an enemy, but he is someone I would describe as a person who measures everything and files it away for later use. And he's measuring me. He's measuring what you represent to me." She absorbed that. "What do I represent to you?" Alessandro looked at her steadily. "A change in how I operate. And for someone like Cesare, a change in how I operate is worth understanding because how I operate affects things that affect him." "What things specifically?" "The Riva account." He nodded at the brief in her hands. "Marco Riva controls significant import routes through southern Italy. I have a long-standing arrangement with him. Cesare has been trying to build his own relationship with Riva for 2 years. If my position with Riva strengthens..." He paused. "Cesare's position weakens," she finished. "Yes." She opened the brief. "Then the meeting with Riva is more important than I understood when you first described it." "Considerably." She scanned the first page, then the second. She stopped. "Alessandro." "Yes." "This meeting is in 4 days." "Yes." "And Riva's primary language of business is Sicilian dialect." "Yes." She looked up. "You were going to tell me this when exactly..." Something moved in his expression that was as close to discomfort as she had ever seen from him. "I was going to tell you this morning." "Because you knew I needed preparation time and you were giving it to me." "Yes." "Or because you weren't sure how I would react to the Cesare Vantini information and you wanted to have the Riva brief as a reason for me to stay in the room." The pause was half a second longer than it needed to be. "Both," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the brief. "Sicilian dialect I can manage. It's closer to what my grandparents spoke than standard Italian. I'll need 2 days to review Riva's correspondence history and anything you have on his family background. Thomas can pull all of it by end of day. I also need to know what specifically Cesare Vantini has offered Riva in the past 2 years. If I'm walking into a room with a man who's been receiving competing attention, I need to understand what he's been offered so I understand what he's actually evaluating." Alessandro's expression shifted into something that looked like it was trying to decide whether to be impressed or unsettled. "That's not information that exists in any file." "No," she agreed. "It's information you're going to have to give me from memory. So I need an hour with you this afternoon, after the brief review, where you tell me everything you know about Cesare Vantini's approach to business relationships. Not the business details, the approach." He nodded. "And one more thing." She set the brief down. "The list I told you I was building this morning, of names from meetings where I thought the reaction to my presence was too controlled." "Yes." She reached into her jacket pocket and placed the folded paper on the desk between them. He picked it up, opened it. She watched his face as he read the 6 names. He was very still for a moment, then he set the paper down carefully. "Where is number 3 on this list?" She looked at the list. Number 3, a man named Dominic Ferrara, who had been in the room during the second meeting she had ever attended for Alessandro, a real estate discussion in a conference room in Midtown. He had said almost nothing the entire meeting, but his eyes had tracked her every movement with the specific attention of someone cataloging rather than observing. "He was in the Midtown meeting 6 weeks ago," she said. "Property discussion." "Yes." Alessandro's voice was carefully level. "Dominic Ferrara is Cesare Vantini's man in New York." The room went quiet. Isabella looked at the list. At the name she had written in her neat, precise handwriting at 7 o'clock that morning, thinking it was simply a person who had seemed too watchful. "He was there before I started," she said. "That meeting was already scheduled." "Yes." "Which means Cesare has had someone in your circle for longer than I've been here." "Yes. And you knew." The pause was one breath long. "I knew about Ferrara. I didn't know about the specific interest in you until last week." She was quiet for a moment. "Why is Ferrara still in your circle if you know who he works for?" "Because a known piece of information is more useful than an unknown one." He met her eyes. "If I remove Ferrara, Cesare sends someone else. Someone I don't know. This way I know where the observation is coming from." She understood the logic immediately. It was the same logic she had used for 2 years at Vittorio's. Knowing which tables to avoid was more useful than pretending the tables didn't exist. "So Ferrara has been reporting on me," she said. "Almost certainly." "What has he been able to report?" "That you attend meetings with me, that you speak Italian, that you identified something in the Fontana account that I had missed." Alessandro paused. "That in Genoa, you managed a dynamic between Marco and Giulia Fontana in a way that materially changed the outcome of a significant account." She thought about that. About what that information looked like from the outside. From Cesare Vantini's perspective in Milan, receiving reports from a man named Ferrara, about a woman who had appeared in Alessandro Moretti's operation and was already changing outcomes in meaningful ways. "He doesn't know what to do with me," she said slowly. "Cesare, I don't fit a category he recognizes." "No," Alessandro said. "You don't. Which is why he's asking questions rather than doing anything, for now." She heard the weight of those 2 words. "Alessandro." She kept her voice even. "What does 'for now' look like when it changes?" He was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding the answer, she could see that. Just choosing how much of the truth to give her, and deciding the way he had on the plane to give all of it. "Cesare has in the past applied pressure to people close to me in order to create leverage over me." He said it simply, without theater. "Not violence. He's not a man who uses violence directly. He uses information. Exposure. The specific kind of pressure that comes from someone knowing things about you that you would prefer remained private." She thought about herself. About what Cesare's man could find if he looked. Her financial situation. Her apartment. Her law school application, which was now sitting in an admissions office somewhere full of her real history and her real ambitions. "I don't have any secrets that would be useful leverage," she said. "You might not know yet what's useful to someone else." That was true. She acknowledged it with a nod. "What I'm telling you," Alessandro said carefully, "is that I intend to make sure you're protected before any of that becomes relevant. I'm telling you now because you deserve to make an informed decision about whether you want to continue." She looked at him. "You're offering me an exit again," she said. "I'm offering you information. What you do with it is your decision." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had brought 2 children across an ocean with $60 and a suitcase, and the absolute refusal to pretend the world was smaller than it was. She thought about her grandfather, who had learned English at 47 and built a business from nothing, and who used to say, "The people who leave when things become complicated were never really there to begin with." "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'm staying." Alessandro looked at her for a moment. Something settled in his face. Not relief exactly, but something in that direction. "Then let's talk about Marco Riva," he said. The afternoon session ran 3 hours. Alessandro talked about Riva. The way you talked about someone you had known for a long time, with the accumulated specificity of a relationship that had layers. Riva was 71. He had built his import operation from a fish market his grandfather had owned in Palermo, and expanded it across 4 decades into something that bore no resemblance to a fish market, but that he still talked about as though it did, because the fish market was where his identity lived. He was proud. He was stubborn. He was deeply, almost pathologically loyal to people who treated him with what he considered appropriate respect, and deeply, almost pathologically unforgiving to people who didn't. He had 3 sons, none of whom worked in the business. He had a daughter, the youngest, who did, and whom he spoke about the way Marco Fontana had spoken about Julia, with a pride he couldn't quite say directly. Another father with a daughter he can't quite tell, Isabella said. Alessandro looked at her. It runs in a certain generation of these families. The fathers built things for their sons, and their sons didn't want them. And the daughters were always running things, she finished. They just weren't allowed to say so. Yes. He paused. Riva's daughter is named Elena. She's 38. She has her father's stubbornness and her mother's political intelligence, which according to people who knew the mother is a formidable combination. Does Elena know about the Vantini interest in the account? Elena knows about everything that affects her father's business. Then she's the person I need to reach, Isabella said. If Marco Riva is evaluating his options, Elena is the one who will tell him what to decide. You can't approach Elena directly. Riva would see that as going around him. I'm not going to approach her. I'm going to be in the room and make sure she knows she's been seen. She picked up her pen. It's different. Alessandro watched her write something in her notes. How do you know she hasn't already been seen? Because if Cesare Vantini's approach to relationships is what you say. It is, he's been courting Marco directly. Old world style. The father. The name. The title. She looked up. And Elena, who is actually running the operation, has been standing slightly to the side, watching a man charm her father while ignoring her, and she has been noting it very carefully. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to do to Elena Riva what you did to Julia Fontana. I'm going to acknowledge a capable woman who has been managing something significant in the margins of what other people pay attention to. She paused. Yes. And you think that's enough? I think it's the beginning of something that Cesare Vantini doesn't know how to do, which means it's the thing he can't counter. She set down her pen. He's been playing the game by the rules everyone knows. I'm playing a different game. Alessandro looked at her for a long time. Isabella, he said finally, I need you to understand something. Tell me. The reason Cesare is watching you is not just because you're changing outcomes in my accounts. He paused. It's because he has never in 20 years of knowing me seen me change how I operate for a person. She absorbed that carefully. He thinks I'm vulnerable, Alessandro said. He thinks the way you affect my decisions is a weakness he can use. Is he wrong? The question came out before she had fully decided to ask it. It was the most direct thing she had said to him about anything that wasn't strictly business, and she felt the weight of it the moment it landed. Alessandro didn't look away. No, he said. He's not entirely wrong. The admission sat between them like something breakable. Then we need to make sure, she said carefully, that when he tries to use it, he finds out he's miscalculated what kind of vulnerability it is. Alessandro said nothing for a moment. Then, what kind of vulnerability is it? She met his eyes. The kind that makes you more careful, not less. The kind that makes you think 3 steps ahead instead of 2. The kind that looks like a weakness from the outside and turns out to be exactly the opposite. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly professional. Then he picked up the Riva brief. We should finish the preparation, he said. Yes, she agreed. They went back to work. But something had shifted in the room, quiet and significant, like the moment after a key turns in a lock. Not the door opening yet, but the mechanism engaged. Neither of them acknowledged it. Both of them felt it. The Riva meeting was in a private dining room in a restaurant on the Upper East Side that was not Vittorio's, but that had the same quality of quiet, expensive purpose. The kind of place where the staff had been carefully selected for the ability to be present without being noticed. Isabella understood that quality better than most. She wore navy that evening, a color her grandmother had once told her was the color of people who wanted to be taken seriously without performing seriousness. She wore no jewelry except small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, which was the closest thing to armor she had. She walked into the room beside Alessandro and Marco. Riva looked at her the way men of his generation looked at unexpected things. A swift, comprehensive assessment followed by the question he didn't ask aloud. Elena Riva looked at her differently. She looked at her the way one careful woman recognized another. Isabella gave her a small nod, the same nod she had given Julia Fontana. Elena's expression didn't change, but her shoulders released approximately 4 degrees of tension. Marco Riva opened the dinner with the formal courtesy of a man who had been doing business over food for 50 years and believed in the protocol of it. Wine first, personal exchange, then business. He spoke in Sicilian-inflected Italian, in not quite dialect, but close the way second-generation immigrants spoke it when they were being most themselves. Isabella understood every syllable. She responded in kind and watched Marco Riva's face do what Marco Fontana's face had done. Not surprise exactly, but the particular softening of a man who has just heard something in his own language in a place he didn't expect it. Palermitana, he asked. From Palermo, my grandparents, she said, but they kept it alive. Come si deve, as one should. He asked about her family. She told him the grandmother, the grandfather's fish market, the kitchen where she learned to hear 3 conversations at once. The last part made him laugh, a real laugh, not a social one, and Elena Riva looked at her father laughing, and then looked at Isabella with an expression that was no longer neutral. It was grateful. The business portion of the evening began after the second course. Marco covered the outline of his position, his current arrangement with Alessandro, the terms he considered satisfactory, the areas he was evaluating for the coming year. He used the word considerando, considering 4 times in 12 minutes. Each time he used it, Elena's posture shifted slightly. Not visibly, not enough for anyone watching casually to notice. But Isabella was not watching casually. She was watching the way Elena's hand moved on the table each time her father said, considerando. Slightly toward the folder in front of her. Slightly toward the document she had brought but not yet opened. She wanted to say something. She was waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was not coming because Marco was holding the floor with the confidence of a man who didn't realize he was withholding it from the person who most needed it. Isabella waited until there was a natural pause, Marco reaching for his wine glass, Alessandro beginning to respond, and she said quietly to Elena, Stavi per aggiungere qualcosa. Were you about to add something? Elena blinked, looked at her father. Marco had paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. The room was still. Then Marco set down his glass and looked at his daughter. Elena, parla. Elena, speak. Something moved across Elena's face, something old and complicated, and finally given room. She opened the folder. What came out of it was 2 years of careful preparation. Market analysis, route projections, a financial model for the coming 3 years that was more sophisticated than anything in the documents Alessandro's team had prepared. Elena Riva had been building a case for a future version of this partnership that was considerably more valuable than the current one, and she had been carrying it in a folder to meetings and waiting for someone to ask. Nobody had asked. Until tonight, Alessandro listened. Isabella watched him listen and saw the moment he understood what he was hearing, not just the data, but the fact that it existed, that it had been sitting across from him in the hands of a woman who had never been given the floor. When Elena finished, Marco Riva was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Sicilian very softly, Mia figlia. My daughter. Just that. 2 words. Elena looked at her father. Marco raised his glass toward her. It was the whole speech. All of it in that gesture. Isabella looked at the tablecloth for a moment because some things deserved privacy even when they happened in front of witnesses. Across the table she felt Alessandro looking at her. She did not look back yet. She gave the moment its full weight. Then she looked up, and Alessandro was watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the controlled assessment, not the almost smile, not the careful respect. Something quieter than all of those. Something that had no professional name. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Elena. Tell me more about the route projections for year 3, she said. I want to make sure we understand them completely. And Elena Riva, who had been carrying 2 years of work in a folder to meetings where no one asked, began to talk. They were in the car home when Alessandro said, "You did it again." "The moment was there," she said. "Someone just had to ask." "I was in the room. I didn't ask." "You were managing Marco. That's what you needed to do." She paused. "We each do the part we can see most clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "Elena's financial model changes the terms of the partnership significantly, in our favor." "I know. That information was sitting across from me at dinner." "Yes." For how long would she have carried it before someone asked? Isabella thought about that. About herself at Vittorio's carrying 2 years of Italian fluency through a dining room full of people who would have found it useful if they'd known to ask. "Long enough to consider other options," she said. Alessandro understood what that meant. Cesare. Eventually. She looked out the window. If no one in Alessandro Moretti's organization ever asked Elena Riva what she actually thought someone else would have, sooner or later, he absorbed that in silence. Then, "Is that how you would have gone?" "Eventually, if I hadn't." He stopped. She turned to look at him. He was looking out the opposite window, and she could see the angle of his jaw, the controlled quality of a man who had started a sentence and was uncertain about how to finish it. "If you hadn't come back to Vittorio's," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. She thought about her kitchen table. The law school application incomplete for 6 weeks. The bills she had been arranging in order of urgency. The very specific exhaustion of being capable in a world that had not yet offered her room to be. "Probably," she said honestly. "Not to Cesare, but somewhere. I was running out of patience for invisibility." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "Good," he said. The simplicity of it landed harder than she expected. "Alessandro," she started. His phone rang. He looked at the screen and everything in his face changed. Not dramatically. Alessandro Moretti did not change dramatically. But the quality of his stillness shifted into something she had never seen from him. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness that was not his usual composure, but something older and colder than composure. He answered. "Yes." She could not hear the other voice. She watched his face. He said nothing for 30 seconds. Then, "Where?" A pause. "Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. He looked at her. "I need to make a stop before we get to your building." "What happened?" He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw him deciding how much to tell her, and then deciding, as he always decided in the end, to tell her the truth. "Someone broke into my Fifth Avenue office tonight," he said. "The one where your desk is." She felt the cold move through her cleanly like water. "My desk," she said. "Yes." "My files." "The notes you keep there, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did they take anything?" "We don't know yet." "Alessandro." She kept her voice steady. "The list I showed you this morning. The 6 names." "Yes." "I made a copy. It's in the top left drawer of my desk." The car was very quiet. "Did I put us in a worse position?" she asked, "by making that list?" "No." His voice was certain. "You put us in a more accurate one." "What's the difference?" He looked at her directly. "The worst position is the one we were already in before you saw it clearly." He paused. "You didn't create the problem. You named it. Those are not the same thing." She held that thought. "What does it mean that they went into the office?" she said. "Specifically, what does Cesare want to know?" "I wants to know how much you know." Alessandro's jaw tightened slightly. "He's been operating on the assumption that you're perceptive, but manageable. That list tells him you're not. So he's reassessing." "Yes." "That changes things." "Yes." She looked out the window at the city, at the particular indifferent beauty of New York at night, which asked nothing from you and offered nothing back except the plain fact of itself enormous and ongoing. "Alessandro." She turned to face him fully. "I need you to stop deciding in private what information is safe to give me." I understand you're trying to manage the risk. But I can't be useful to you if I'm working with incomplete information. And I can't protect myself if I don't know what I'm protecting myself from." He looked at her. She held his gaze with everything she had, not challenging him, not performing bravery. She didn't feel, just meeting him directly with the truth. "From this point," she said, "everything. Do you understand me?" The pause lasted 3 full seconds. "Yes," he said. "All of it." "All of it," he agreed. The car pulled up to the Fifth Avenue building. He got out first and then held the door for her, which he had never done before, and she understood that the gesture was not about courtesy. It was about the 30 seconds of standing beside someone before you walked into something uncertain together. She stepped out. The night air was cold. She stood beside him for a moment on the sidewalk, the city moving around them, and she thought, this is where the easy part ends. Not with a speech, not with a scene. Just a cold night in November, a broken lock on an office door somewhere above them, and the two of them standing at the edge of something that was about to require everything they had. "Ready," he said. She thought of her grandmother crossing an ocean. "Yes," she said. And they walked in. The notes Isabella had promised by noon were on Alessandro's desk at 11:47. She knew because she timed it deliberately, not to impress him, but because she had discovered in the past 6 weeks that Alessandro Moretti operated on a clock that most people never saw. He did not wear his urgency publicly. He did not tap his foot or check his watch. But beneath the composed exterior of the man was a person who measured reliability in minutes, not intentions, and who had learned probably very early in his life that the distance between what someone promised and what they delivered was the most honest measurement of who they actually were. Isabella intended to be measured honestly. She intended that about everything. The Riva account brief was 41 pages. She had condensed it to 6 with notations in the margins, where the language shifted from formal to evasive, and 3 flagged sections, where the terms as written did not match the terms as implied in the accompanying correspondence. Alessandro read all 6 pages without speaking. Then he looked up. "Page 4, he said. "The indemnification clause. It's written to protect Riva in the event of a regulatory action." She sat across from him. "But the corresponding letter from their legal team uses the phrase, anticipated regulatory review. Not hypothetical. Anticipated." She paused. "They know something is coming. They're trying to shift exposure before it arrives." The silence was sharp. "When did you catch that?" he said. "Last night. On the plane after you told me someone was asking questions about me." She met his eyes. "I needed something to focus on." He looked at her steadily. "You work when you're unsettled." "Doesn't everyone?" "No," he said. "Most people stop working when they're unsettled. They process. They worry." He closed the brief. "You read 41 pages of financial documentation at 11 o'clock at night and found a buried indemnification trap." It wasn't buried very well. Isabella. He said her name the way he always did, all 4 syllables, nothing wasted. "I pulled the Riva account from my previous advisor 8 months ago because he missed exactly this kind of language. He had been working in this industry for 20 years. She said nothing. "You've been here 6 weeks. "I've been reading since I was 4, she said. "And my grandmother made me read contracts before I understood what contracts were, because she said anyone who put words on paper to govern your life deserved to have those words examined very carefully." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "What was her name?" The question surprised her. "Carmela. Carmela Romano. Carmela Esposito Romano." She kept both names because she said a woman who gave up her name gave up her history. Something moved in Alessandro's face. Something careful and briefly unguarded. "She sounds like someone I would have been afraid of." "She would have liked that," Isabella said. He almost smiled. Then he picked up the brief again and said in the tone that meant they were back to work, "We're postponing the Riva meeting until we understand what regulatory action they're anticipating. I'll have Marco look into it from the legal side." "There's a faster way," she said. He looked up. "Riva's CFO is a man named Benedetto Caruso." Not related to the restaurant family, different Carusos entirely. Benedetto grew up in Calabria and has a younger sister who married into the DeSantis family in Rome. She paused. The DeSantis family has significant interests in the regulatory body that oversees Riva's primary market. If there's an anticipated review, Benedetto already knows the shape of it. Alessandro set down the brief. Very slowly. How do you know about Benedetto Caruso's sister? It was in the background documentation your office prepared on Riva. Page 37. It was listed as a personal note with no business relevance flagged. She paused. I flagged it. Because everything is connected. Because family is always relevant, she said. In Italian business culture especially. A man with a sister connected to a regulatory body who is trying to shift indemnification exposure is not hiding a legal problem. He's managing a family negotiation that has spilled into business. Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. Cancel the Riva meeting, he said to whoever answered. Reschedule for 3 weeks out. No explanation given. He hung up. He looked at Isabella. I want a full profile on Benedetto Caruso and the DeSantis family by end of week. You'll have it by Thursday. I said end of week. I heard you, she said. You'll have it by Thursday. She stood and walked back toward her desk, and she did not need to turn around to know he was watching her go with the expression he wore when something had happened that he had not fully expected and was not yet sure how to categorize. She was becoming familiar with that expression. She was not sure yet how she felt about the fact that she was becoming familiar with it. Thursday arrived, and with it the Caruso profile, and with it something else entirely. Isabella was at her desk at 7 in the morning, earlier than anyone else in the office by at least 40 minutes, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. No area code she knew. International but not Italian, something else. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered instead. A man's voice. Smooth, educated English, spoken with the faint overlay of someone who had learned it as a third language. Miss Romano, I apologize for the early hour. Who is this? A friend of several people you've recently met. A pause. Including some you haven't met yet. Her hand tightened on the phone. That's not an answer. No, he agreed pleasantly. It isn't. But it's all I'm prepared to offer at the moment. A pause. I wanted to tell you something because I believe you're intelligent enough to use the information correctly. You've attracted attention, Miss Romano. Not the comfortable kind. I've been made aware. Have you? He sounded briefly interested. Moretti told you. That's unlike him. Another pause. He must trust you considerably. What do you want? Nothing from you. His voice remained pleasant, which was more unsettling than aggression would have been. I want you to understand something very clearly, because I suspect nobody has said it plainly yet. Alessandro Moretti is a powerful man. He is also a targeted man. He has been navigating certain pressures for the past 18 months that have required a great deal of careful management. Your presence at his side has accelerated a timeline that several parties were counting on moving slowly. Isabella kept her breathing even. Which parties? That's the question, isn't it? He paused. There's a meeting happening in 12 days, in Milan, under the guise of a hospitality industry conference, which I understand Mr. Moretti is attending. The people who have been asking questions about you will also be there. Why are you telling me this? Because I want to see what you do with it. A pause. And because I believe the outcome of that meeting depends significantly on whether someone in that room understands what's actually being negotiated, which based on what I've observed is precisely your skill set. You've been observing me. For approximately 3 weeks. No apology in his voice, just fact. Since Genoa. You were remarkable with the Fontana situation, by the way. The call ended. No goodbye. No further information. The line simply went quiet. Isabella sat very still for 11 seconds. Then she got up, walked down the hall, and knocked on Alessandro's office door. He looked up. His expression shifted the moment he saw her face. Someone called me, she said. I need you to listen to everything I'm about to tell you and not make any decisions until I finish. He closed the folder in front of him. Sit down. I don't want to sit down. She stood in front of his desk and told him everything. Every word. The exact phrasing, the pauses, the pleasant tone that was worse than anger. When she finished, the office was very quiet. Alessandro's face had done several things during her account that she had not seen it do before. None of them were performed for her benefit. They were the involuntary responses of a man receiving information that was rearranging something inside him. He knew about Genoa, Alessandro said. In detail. Yes. That means he has a source inside my operation, or a very good external surveillance position. He was quiet. Possibly both. He said my presence accelerated a timeline. Yes. His jaw tightened. There are organizations that have been waiting for me to make an error in judgment, to bring someone into my confidence who could be leveraged. He paused. Or someone whose vulnerability could be used. You think they plan to use me as leverage? He met her eyes. I think that's one possibility I have to consider. Isabella held his gaze. Alessandro, am I actually useful to you in what you do, or am I the most expensive mistake you've made in 15 years? The directness of the question landed in the room like a physical thing. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the answer forming, rather than heard it. You are the most genuinely useful person I have worked with in a decade, he said. Not quickly, carefully, each word chosen with the same precision she used when she was reading a document for the truth beneath the language. You have found things in 6 weeks that my people have missed for years. You have managed relationships I was losing. And you did it without compromising a single principle. A pause. That is not a mistake. That is the opposite of a mistake. Then we go to Milan, she said. He looked at her. Isabella. The man on the phone told me about that meeting because he wants to see what I do with the information. If we don't go, we've already answered his question. If we go, and we're prepared. She stopped. We control what happens in that room. We don't know who's in that room. We have 12 days to find out. A long silence. Alessandro leaned back. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was running the full calculation, not just the immediate move, but the 3 moves after it. You're not afraid, he said. I'm afraid of the right things, she said. I'm not afraid of this. He studied her face for a long moment. All right, he said. Milan. The 12 days before Milan were the most intense of Isabella's professional life, and she had by any measure lived a professionally intense life. She built the profile on Benedetto Caruso and delivered it Thursday as promised, and in doing so, discovered that the DeSantis regulatory connection ran deeper than the family marriage. Julia DeSantis Benedetto's sister-in-law sat on a review board that had the authority to freeze asset transfers in the Italian property market. The Amalfi acquisition. The one with Salvatore De Luca that had started all of this fell squarely within that market. It was not a coincidence. She brought that discovery to Alessandro on a Friday evening, and for the first time since she had started working for him, he looked genuinely blindsided. They're connected, he said. Riva De Luca, the regulatory review. He stood. Somebody has been building a position around me for months. Around your Italian portfolio specifically, she said. Everything touches Italy. The Amalfi property, the Genoa account, the Riva hospitality deal. She spread the documents across his desk. If someone wanted to apply maximum pressure to your operations in a single coordinated move, they would freeze these 3 simultaneously. And the Milan meeting is where they decide whether to execute, or where they make a final offer before they execute. She looked at him. Someone wants something from you. This isn't destruction. This is leverage. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment. He walked to the window. She had noticed he did this when he needed to think. Standing with his back to the room, looking at nothing particular, and he stayed there for nearly a full minute. Then he turned around. There is one person, he said, who has the relationships to connect all 3 of those accounts and the motivation to want leverage over me. He paused. His name is Dante Ricci. She had not seen that name in any of the documents. Who is he? Someone I have known for 30 years. The quality of his voice had changed not dramatically, but in the way a voice changed when the thing being discussed was not business. We grew up together. We built the early parts of this operation together. He paused. We parted ways 12 years ago over a disagreement that was never fully resolved. What kind of disagreement? The kind that is also a betrayal. He said it without self-pity, just fact. He believed I owed him a partnership that I had decided he had forfeited. He believed I was wrong. I believe I was not. And for 12 years we have operated in the same world without directly colliding. He paused. Until now. Isabella absorbed that. He's been patient. He is an exceptionally patient man. Alessandro came back to the desk and sat. He would have spent years building the position you just identified. He would have enjoyed the architecture of it. What does he want? Control of the Italian portfolio. A pause. And possibly an apology, though he would never call it that. Which you won't give. Which I won't give. He held her gaze. Not under coercion. Then Milan is a negotiation. Milan is a declaration, he said. He will put everything on the table and watch me decide. And if you refuse, then he activates the regulatory review, the Riva exposure, and the De Luca complication, simultaneously, and I spend the next 2 years in legal proceedings that will cost more than the portfolio is worth. Isabella was quiet for a moment. He doesn't want the portfolio, she said. Alessandro looked at her. If he wanted the portfolio, he would have executed already. He's had months. He would have built the position and used it. She paused. He's going to Milan to be in the same room with you. He could have done all of this by proxy. She paused. What does he actually want? Alessandro was very still. To be right, he said, very quietly. He wants me to acknowledge in front of witnesses that what I did 12 years ago was wrong. Was it? The silence that followed that question was the longest Isabella had sat in since she started working for Alessandro Moretti. She counted it. 8 seconds. It was complicated, he said. That's not an answer. He looked at her. Something in his face was doing the thing it did when he was deciding how much truth to start with, and then deciding to start with all of it. He had a family, Alessandro said. I knew about a situation that put his family at risk. I made a decision to protect the operation rather than tell him what I knew. His family was not harmed, ultimately it resolved. But I kept information from him that was his to have because I was afraid of what he would do with it. A pause. He found out 3 months after the fact. He called it a betrayal. I called it a necessary calculation. He paused. I was wrong. I have known I was wrong for most of the 12 years since. I simply haven't said so. The room was very quiet. Why not? Isabella asked. Because admitting it would have meant admitting it under terms he set. And I could not accept the terms. She looked at him for a long time. What if the terms changed? What do you mean? What if you said it before he could demand it? She paused. In Milan. Before the meeting reaches its confrontation point. If you acknowledge it first voluntarily without coercion, it's no longer a weapon he holds. It becomes a truth you offered. She met his eyes. And that changes everything about the negotiation that follows. Alessandro looked at her with an expression that was not quite any single thing. Not gratitude. Not resistance. Not calculation. Something more complicated than all of those combined. You want me to walk into that meeting and apologize to Dante Ricci, he said. I want you to tell the truth to a man who has spent 12 years waiting for it, she said. What you call it is your choice. He was quiet for a long time. If I do this, he said finally, and it doesn't work if he uses it as further leverage rather than accepting it for what it is. Then we're in the same position we're in right now, and we handle it from there, she paused. But I don't think that's what happens. Because I think Dante Ricci is a man who has been patient for 12 years, not because he wanted the portfolio, but because he wanted to be believed. Alessandro leaned back. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. How do you do that? He said, very quietly. Do what? See directly into the center of a thing. He shook his head. I've had lawyers, strategists, advisors who've spent their careers in this world. Not one of them said what you just said. They were thinking about the portfolio, she said. I was thinking about the person. He held her gaze. And that's what your grandmother taught you. That, and how to make the best Sunday gravy in 3 boroughs. She paused. But mostly the first thing. For the first time in all the weeks she had known him, Alessandro Moretti actually smiled. Not the almost smile. Not the corner-of-the-mouth suggestion. A real one, brief and unguarded and completely unlike the public face of the man everyone in this city was careful around. It changed his face entirely. She looked away first. Because she needed to. 3 days before Milan, the threat arrived. Not from Dante Ricci. From someone else. Isabella was leaving the Fifth Avenue building at 7:30 in the evening when a man fell into step beside her. She did not know him. Medium-height nondescript coat, the deliberate unremarkability of someone who had practiced being forgettable. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked beside her for half a block and said in Italian very quietly, "You should go home, Miss Romano. Back to your restaurant, before this stops being a warning." She kept walking. Her heart rate climbed, but she controlled her breathing, and she kept her stride exactly even because any change in pace was information she was not willing to give him. "Who sent you?" she said, in Italian, matching his register precisely. "Someone who hopes you make the right choice." "Is this the right choice?" She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly. "Standing on the street threatening a woman because the man you work for is afraid of what she might say in a meeting." He blinked, just slightly. "Go back," she said in the flat, even tone of someone who has decided something and is not renegotiating it. "Tell whoever sent you that I received the message. Tell them I considered it carefully." She paused. "Tell them I declined." She walked away. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked 2 blocks to the corner, turned, and leaned against the wall of a building for exactly 45 seconds while she let her heart do what it needed to do. Then she called Alessandro. He picked up on the second ring. She told him what had happened. Every word. The Italian dialect the man had used, northern, probably Milanese, which meant this was already connected to the Milan trip. The exact phrasing of the threat. The fact that he had described it as a warning, which meant it was the first one rather than the final one. Alessandro was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Are you all right?" Not strategically. Not what was the man's height. What was his approximate age? What was his coat color? Those questions came later. First, "Are you all right?" She exhaled. "Yes." "Where are you?" she told him. "Don't move," he said. She waited. He arrived in 9 minutes, which meant he had been closer than she knew, or faster than she expected. Probably both. He stepped out of the car and covered the distance between them and stopped when he was 2 feet from her. He looked at her face. All of it. The way he looked at things when he was reading beneath the surface. "You're sure you're all right?" he said. "I'm sure." "You don't look afraid." "I told you. I'm afraid of the right things." She paused. "This made me angry, not afraid. There's a difference." His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something controlled and very cold. "This is my fault." "This is Dante Ricci's fault," she said. "Or whoever sent that man, not yours." "Isabella, you didn't threaten me. Someone who wants leverage over you threatened me." She held his gaze. "Those are different things. I need you to understand the distinction clearly, because if you spend the next 3 days trying to manage my safety instead of managing Milan, we lose on both counts." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are the most infuriating person," he said, and it came out with something that was almost affection. "I've been told that," she said. He opened the car door. "Get in. We're going to talk about security." She got in. He followed. The car moved. And Isabella, sitting in the dark of the back seat with the city lights moving past the window, thought about a man who had stood beside her on a sidewalk and called, leaving a warning, and about the very specific quality of fear that came from understanding clearly and without self-deception that you were now in something real. She had known it was real from the beginning. She had accepted that from the moment she said yes in that back office at Vittorio's. But knowing a thing in the abstract and feeling it on a sidewalk in the dark were two different experiences. She was not going to pretend they were the same. She was also not going to let it change a single decision she had already made. She looked at Alessandro in the seat beside her. He was on his phone speaking in low, rapid Italian to someone she caught the name of the security director, a man named Parisi. Arrangements being made. A protection detail she was going to have to negotiate about later. He caught her looking. He held up one finger one moment and finished the call. "I'm assigning someone to you," he said, "starting tonight. I would like to discuss the terms of that. Isabella, I'm not refusing, I'm discussing." She kept her voice steady. "One person, stays outside visible range, doesn't speak to me unless I speak first. I retain full mobility." He studied her. "Those are very specific conditions. I spent 2 years in Section 4 learning to move through rooms full of powerful men without being made smaller by their presence," she said. "I'm not going to start now." A pause. Then, "Agreed." She nodded. "There is something I want to tell you," he said. In a different tone, not the operational one, not the careful one. Something more direct. "Before Milan. Because in Milan things will move quickly and there may not be a moment." She waited. "What you said about Dante," he said. "About him waiting to be believed rather than wanting the portfolio." He paused. "That was the most accurate reading of a situation I have received in 15 years of working in rooms full of people paid to read situations." He paused. "And I want you to know that I heard it, not just as strategy, as truth." She looked at him. "I kept something from someone who deserved to know it," he said, "because I was afraid of the consequences of honesty, and I have paid the price of that decision for 12 years. He met her eyes. "I am not going to make that kind of decision again." The weight of what he wasn't quite saying settled in the car between them. Not quite a declaration, not quite a promise, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. Isabella held his gaze. "Good," she said, simply. She turned back to the window. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark glass, steady, clear-eyed, fully present. The woman who had spent 2 years learning to disappear was still in there somewhere, but she was a great deal harder to find than she used to be. And in 3 days, she was going to walk into a room in Milan with the most feared man in New York, face the person who had just sent someone to warn her off a public sidewalk, and do what she had always done best. Listen, read, and say the thing nobody else in the room was willing to say. She had been preparing this her whole life. She just hadn't known it yet. The morning after Milan, Isabella woke up in her own apartment for the first time in 9 days and lay completely still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle around her like something she had forgotten the texture of. 9 days. That was how long the aftermath of the Milan meeting had taken to resolve, not dramatically, not with any single explosive conclusion, but the way real things resolved slowly in layers, with the particular exhaustion of people who had been operating at full intensity and were now processing the cost of it. She thought about Dante Ricci's face when Alessandro had said what he said. She thought about it, the way you thought about a thing that had shifted something fundamental, not obsessively, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that certain moments were load-bearing, that certain seconds held more weight than entire years, and that what she had witnessed in that conference room in Milan was one of those seconds. Alessandro had walked in first. She had walked in beside him, not behind him, which was a choice they had discussed, and which Dante had clearly registered. She saw it in the fractional stillness of his expression. When the door opened the micro-recalibration of a man who had prepared for one version of this meeting and found that version already modified. Dante Ricci was 61 years old and looked like a man who had carried significant weight for a long time and had made peace with the carrying. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with eyes that were dark and precise and missing nothing. He had 3 men with him. Alessandro had brought Parisi and one other. Isabella had brought nothing except everything she had learned in the past 3 months, which turned out to be enough. The meeting had begun in Italian. Dante's choice. A declaration of territory before a single word of business was spoken. Isabella had understood every syllable which Dante had not known at the time, and which Alessandro had not revealed, because some advantages were best held quietly until the right moment. That moment had come 14 minutes in. But she was getting ahead of herself. She got up, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with the cup warming her hands, and she let the memory of those 9 days come back in order, because order mattered when you were trying to understand what had actually happened versus what it had felt like while it was happening. The first thing that had happened in Milan was that Alessandro had not waited for the formal opening of the meeting. He had walked into the conference room, sat across from Dante Ricci, and before anyone arranged papers, or opened folders, or went through the ritual performance of business pleasantries, he had said in Italian quietly and without theater, "Ho fatto una cosa sbagliata. Lo so da 12 anni. E avrei dovuto dirtelo molto prima d'ora." I did something wrong. I have known it for 12 years, and I should have told you long before now. The room had gone very still. Isabella, sitting at the far end of the table, slightly to the side, placed there deliberately in the position of an observer, rather than a participant, because that was the position from which she could see everything watched. Dante Ricci's face do something she had not expected. She had expected resistance, calculation, the expression of a man receiving a concession and rapidly assessing how to use it. Instead, Dante looked like a man who had been holding a door shut against something heavy for a very long time and had just felt the pressure on the other side ease. His hands flat on the table relaxed by a fraction. Nobody else in the room would have seen it. She saw it. Dante said nothing for 8 seconds. 8 full seconds, which in a room full of men who dealt in power was an eternity. Then he said in Italian very quietly, "Perché adesso?" "Why now?" Alessandro said, "Because someone recently showed me what the cost of waiting looks like from the other side." Dante's eyes moved for just a moment to Isabella. She kept her expression neutral. She did not look away. Dante looked back at Alessandro. "Who is she?" "The most important advisor I have ever employed," Alessandro said, simply and without embellishment. Another silence. Then Dante Ricci did something that his 3 associates clearly had not anticipated, because she saw 2 of them exchange a glance of involuntary surprise. He laughed. Not a long laugh. Not a warm one. More the sound a man made when something landed in an unexpected place. "You brought a woman to this meeting." "I brought the person who understood what this meeting was actually about," Alessandro said. "Her gender is incidental." "And what?" Dante said, looking back at Isabella. "Does she believe this meeting is about?" He had addressed Alessandro, Isabella answered. In Italian, in the precise Palermo-inflected Italian, her grandmother had taught her, clear and unhurried. "It's about 12 years of a debt that was never paid, not a financial debt, the kind that costs more than money." She paused. "You didn't build a 3-continent leverage position because you want Alessandro's Italian portfolio. You built it because you wanted to be in the same room with him with enough weight on your side that he couldn't walk away before you finished saying what you came to say." The room was completely silent. Dante Ricci looked at her for a long moment. "Palermo," he said. "See. Your grandparents. My grandmother especially." Something shifted in his face, not softened exactly, but adjusted the way a position adjusted when new information arrived that changed its angle. "What's your name?" "Isabella Romano." "Romano." He considered it. "And how did you come to be sitting in this room, Isabella Romano?" "I was a waitress," she said. "I answered when someone spoke to me in Italian, and everyone else decided not to hear." Another silence. Then Dante said, still in Italian, still looking at her, "And you believe Alessandro is telling the truth, that he has known he was wrong?" "I believe he has known it for a long time," she said carefully. "I believe the knowing has cost him, and I believe the reason it took 12 years to say is not that he didn't want to say it. It's that he couldn't find a way to say it that didn't feel like surrender." She paused. "I told him that saying it first wasn't surrender. That saying it first was the only version of this conversation where both of you came out whole. Dante was very still. "She told you that," he said to Alessandro. "She told me that," Alessandro confirmed. A long pause. Then Dante Ricci reached forward and turned his folder face down on the table. The gesture was small. The meaning was enormous. Every person in the room understood what it meant. The prepared position was being set aside. "Allora parliamo," he said. "Then let us talk." Sitting at her kitchen table now, 9 days later, Isabella wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and thought about what had come after those words. They had talked for 4 hours. Not negotiation conversation. The kind that happened when two people who had been building walls toward each other for a decade finally agreed to put down the bricks. Alessandro talked about the decision he had made 12 years ago and why he had made it. And for the first time he said the word paura, fear, out loud, which from a man like Alessandro was a more significant concession than any legal or financial term in the room. Dante talked about what it had cost his family. Not in crisis the situation had resolved as Alessandro had said, but in trust. In the particular damage that came from discovering that someone you considered a partner had made a choice about your life without your knowledge. Isabella translated almost none of it. She didn't need to. But she watched both of them, the way she had always watched rooms for the moment when language stopped being a vehicle for information and started being a vehicle for something more fundamental. For the moment, when a conversation stopped being about what was said and became about whether two people could tolerate being honest with each other. That moment had come in hour 3, when Alessandro said something that had clearly cost him considerably to say. And Dante had gone quiet for almost a full minute, and then said in a voice that had lost most of its formal armor, "Dovevi avere fiducia in me." You should have trusted me. And Alessandro had said, "Lo so, avrei dovuto." I know. I should have. Isabella had looked at her hands in her lap. She had thought about her grandmother, about a kitchen in Brooklyn and the smell of tomatoes and old wood, about a woman who had taught her that the most powerful thing language could do was not win arguments, but build the thing that came after arguments were over. She had thought, "Nonna, look what your Italian did." And she had kept her face perfectly still so that nobody in that room would see that she was quietly and without any performance of it moved. The resolution had not been simple or clean, because real resolutions never were. Dante did not simply withdraw the leverage position. There were terms. There were agreements about the Italian portfolio that gave Dante's organization a formal partnership stake in 3 of the properties, which was less than he had positioned to demand, and more than Alessandro would have offered a month ago. There were legal frameworks to be built, which meant weeks of work for multiple teams of lawyers. But the regulatory threat evaporated. The Riva exposure was addressed through a direct conversation between Alessandro and Benedetto Caruso that Isabella had prepared him for, with a thoroughness that had made Caruso visibly uncomfortable, and then, when his discomfort passed, genuinely relieved. The De Luca Amalfi acquisition moved forward on the revised timeline with Salvatore's wife's family connection formally acknowledged in the historical record of the property rather than buried beneath it, which turned out to be what she had wanted all along. Giulia Fontana was formally designated as account director for the Genoa relationship with her father's public endorsement. She had called Isabella the day after to say thank you, and the call had lasted 20 minutes and covered 3 different topics. And at the end, Giulia had said, "You should come to Genoa. My father wants to cook for you." Isabella had said she would try. She meant it. And the man who had approached her on the sidewalk with a warning. He had been identified within 4 days, a mid-level operative connected to a faction within Dante's organization that had been running its own agenda, anticipating a more aggressive outcome from Milan than Dante himself intended. Dante had handled it personally and had called Alessandro to say so, which Alessandro had relayed to Isabella with an expression that told her the call had been brief and conclusive. That faction would not be a problem again. None of which resolved the question that had been quietly present beneath all of it, beneath the files and the flights and the 4-hour conversation in Milan and the 9 days of resolution. The question that Isabella had been carrying with the particular careful precision of someone who knew that the handling of a thing determined what it became. The question of what she and Alessandro actually were to each other now. She was still sitting at her kitchen table when her phone rang. Not an unknown international number this time. Alessandro's direct line, which she had known by heart for 6 weeks and had never once had to look up. She answered. "You're home," he said. "I've been home since last night. You knew that." "I did," he agreed. "I wanted to give you one evening before I called." She looked at her coffee cup. That was considerate. "I'm trying something new." A pause. Not uncomfortable, the kind that meant he was deciding something. "I want to see you today. Not for work." She was very still. "What does that mean?" she said. Not a challenge. Just the question asked precisely. "It means I want to have a conversation that has nothing to do with any file on any desk in any office." His voice was steady, but she could hear underneath it the particular quality of a man who had made a decision he was not certain about and was executing it anyway. "It means I would like to sit across from you in a room that isn't a conference room without any agenda and see what that's like." She said nothing for a moment. "Alessandro." "Yes. You understand that I have spent 3 months being very careful about the line between what this is professionally and what it might be otherwise." "I know." "You understand that I drew that line for reasons that still exist." "I know that too." A pause. "I'm not asking you to erase the line. I'm asking if we can acknowledge that there's something on the other side of it." She exhaled. "You're asking me to have coffee with you." "I'm asking you to have coffee with me and not treat it as a professional meeting." She looked at the window. At the light coming through the ordinary Thursday morning light of a city that had no idea what the past 3 months had contained. She thought about the moment in the car after the sidewalk encounter. "Are you all right first before strategy?" She thought about the smile on the plane to Genoa, the real one, the one that had changed his face. She thought about him standing beside her at the car door at JFK at midnight and saying good work. The way you said it when you meant something more than the words. She thought about her grandmother, who had also taught her this, Isabella, when a door opens that you have been waiting in front of, the foolish thing is not to walk through. The foolish thing is to pretend you haven't been waiting. 1 o'clock, she said. "There's a place on Mulberry Street. It's not expensive and it's not impressive, and the coffee is genuinely the best in the city." A pause. "Mulberry Street. Little Italy," she said. "I grew up 4 blocks away. I want to be on my own ground for this." Another pause. And then quietly, "Fair enough." She arrived at 12:58, and he was already there, which surprised her. Alessandro Moretti, who had a driver and a schedule that operated on its own gravitational field, was sitting at a corner table in a coffee shop on Mulberry Street, with his coat over the back of the chair, and his phone face down on the table, and no visible security presence, which meant Parisi was somewhere outside maintaining the agreed distance. He looked, she thought, like a person, not the Mafia boss, not the power at the center of a complex operational web, not the man that 300 people in this city were careful around. Just a person sitting at a table waiting. He stood when she came in, which was a small thing, and also not small at all. She sat across from him. The coffee came quickly, because she had called ahead, which was the kind of knowledge you accumulated over 23 years of living 4 blocks from a place. They were quiet for the moment, not uncomfortable. Just the particular quiet of 2 people who had been talking at very high intensity for 3 months, and were now discovering what it felt like to have a conversation with no stakes attached to it. It felt, Isabella thought, both easier and harder than she expected. Easier because the ease was real. She had always been able to talk to him from the first 60 seconds at table 7. Harder because without the professional frame around it, the thing that had always been underneath was simply more visible. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with work," he said. She looked at him. "That's a strange way to start. I've been starting conversations about files and accounts for 3 months. I want to start a different kind." She considered. "I play the piano badly." He raised an eyebrow. "Badly." "I played well until I was 16. Then I stopped practicing because I was working, and studying and practicing felt like a luxury I couldn't justify. By the time I had time to go back to it, I had lost most of the technical skill." She paused. "I play anyway, just badly." "What do you play? Whatever I feel like. Usually Italian composers. Occasionally something my grandmother used to hum that I've tried to reconstruct from memory and is probably not accurate. He was quiet for a moment. I had a piano, growing up. I never learned to play it. It was my mother's. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table in the way people looked at surfaces when they were accessing something from a long time ago. What happened to it? She asked. It's still there. In a house I own on Long Island that I haven't been to in 4 years. He paused. I should probably do something about that. The house or the piano? Both. A pause. Maybe neither. He looked up. Tell me something else. I submitted my law school application, she said. The day after I accepted your offer, and I got a response 3 weeks ago. She paused. I've been admitted for the spring semester. He stared at her. You've known for 3 weeks. I've been a little busy. Isabella. Something moved in his voice. Something warm and exasperated, and something that was also very clearly proud. That's significant. It's what I've been working toward for 2 years. I know it is. He leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't sure how it would change things. She looked at him steadily. The terms of my employment included time to finish the application. They didn't include a plan for what happened when I was admitted. He was quiet. The program is evening and weekend, she said. It's designed for working professionals. I've looked at the schedule, and I believe I can manage both. She paused. But I wanted to have this conversation honestly, rather than waiting until it became complicated. You thought I might create obstacles. I thought you might want to. Not out of malice, out of operational preference. She held his gaze. I wanted to give you the honest version, so that whatever you decided came from the truth, rather than from not knowing. He looked at her for a long moment. Isabella, he said. I am going to tell you something that I have not said to another person in a professional capacity in 15 years. She waited. Whatever you decide to do, law school, the position, how those two things coexist or don't, I will work around your terms. He paused. Not because you are useful to me, though you are. Not because I can't afford to lose you, though I can't. He paused. Because you have earned the right to make your own choices without managing my reaction to them. And I am not going to be the person who makes your ambitions smaller to fit my convenience. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like espresso and old brick. Isabella looked at the man across from her. The man, everyone in this city walked carefully around the man who had spent 15 years accumulating power, and 12 of those years carrying a debt he hadn't known how to pay, and she thought about what it actually meant to know a person. Not their function, not their reputation, not the version of them that existed in other people's careful behavior around them, the actual person. Thank you, she said, simply. He nodded once. Now, she said, tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with work. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him casting about for it, the honest answer, not the managed one. I cook, he said finally. Not well, but I cook. Sunday mornings when I'm in New York and there's nothing scheduled. I make the same 3 things my mother made because they're the only 3 things I know, and I make them badly, and I eat them alone. He paused. I haven't told anyone that before. She felt something shift in her chest, carefully and precisely. What are the 3 things? She asked. Pasta e fagioli, saltimbocca, and a bread that doesn't have a name. It was just something she made. I've never been able to get the texture exactly right. My grandmother made something like that, Isabella said. She said the texture came from the water, that every city's water made a different bread. She paused. She might have been right. He looked at her. She might have. A silence. Then he said quietly, I want to tell you something else. She waited. In Milan, when you spoke to Dante. He paused. When you told him what the meeting was really about. When you said in front of everyone the thing that I had been unable to say for 12 years. He stopped. Started again. I have been in a great many rooms with a great many people who were paid to be smart. I have never watched anyone do what you did in that room. With nothing. No position, no threat, no leverage. Just language and honesty and the precise understanding of what a person actually needed. She held his gaze. "That wasn't nothing," he said. "I need you to know that I know it wasn't nothing." "I know you know," she said. "Do you?" He leaned forward slightly. "Because I'm not sure I've made it adequately clear." "You've been making it clear for 3 months," she said. "Every time you listened when I told you something difficult. Every time you adjusted instead of overriding." She paused. "Every time you said agreed when I said a condition instead of arguing about the terms." She looked at him directly. "Alessandro, I'm very good at reading subtext. You have not been subtle." He looked at her. Something in his face that had been very carefully managed for a very long time did something quiet and irreversible. "No," he said. "I suppose I haven't been." She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. "There are things that will be complicated," she said. "About this, whatever this is." "I know. Your world doesn't simplify for personal relationships." "No, it doesn't. And I won't be managed protected from information or kept at the edges of decisions that affect me. I know that too. I'll say it anyway because I prefer it on record." She paused. "I am not a person who makes myself smaller to fit the dimensions of someone else's life. I found that out the hard way over 2 years of doing exactly that, and I'm done with it." He held her gaze steadily. "I am not asking you to be smaller. I haven't asked that once." "No," she said. "You haven't." A pause. "I also won't pretend," she said, "that the past 3 months haven't changed things, because they have, and I don't pretend about things." She looked at him evenly. "So if you're asking what I think you're asking, the answer is yes. With all of the conditions already on record, the answer is yes." The moment sat between them. Alessandro exhaled just slightly. Just the fraction of release that a person allowed themselves when something they had been carrying with care for a long time could be set down. "Thank you," he said. "You already said that today," she told him. It warranted saying twice. She almost smiled. Not quite. Then she did. The months that followed did not move in a straight line because nothing real ever did. There were complications, as she had predicted. Moments when the structure of Alessandro's world pressed against the structure of her independence and required careful navigation from both sides. Moments when she was in rooms that were difficult and chose to stay anyway, because staying was different from being required to stay, and she had always known the difference. She started law school in January. Evening classes 3 nights a week and Saturday mornings. She finished her first semester with the highest marks in 2 of her 4 courses, and managed the 3rd and 4th with the particular grim efficiency of someone who had learned to operate under resource pressure and no longer apologized for the result. Alessandro learned the bread recipe. It took 4 attempts, conducted on 4 separate Sunday mornings, in a kitchen that was a great deal better equipped than the one his mother had used with Isabella consulting by phone from her apartment because she refused to simply do it for him. "The water," she said on the 4th attempt. "Slightly warmer than you think it needs to be." A long pause on his end. Then, "It's right." She could hear it in his voice, the particular quiet of someone who had recovered something. "Good," she said. "Eat it before it gets cold." He came to her first law school lecture. She had not invited him. He appeared at the back of the auditorium and left before the end, so that she would not see him, which meant he underestimated how aware she was of rooms. She saw him the moment he walked in, and she did not look at him, and she did not look away from her professor, and she felt somewhere in her chest the warm and slightly exasperated thing she was becoming accustomed to feeling. She told him about it afterward. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "It wasn't a performance that required an audience." "I wasn't there as an audience." A pause. "I was there because it was important to you. And things that are important to you are important to me. That's how this works." She had no immediate answer for that, which was in her experience the most honest response. A year after the night at Table 7, Vittorio's hosted a private dinner. Not unusual. Vittorio's hosted private dinners regularly. But this one was different because Isabella was on the guest list rather than the staff list, which she discovered when the invitation arrived at her office. Address her actual office, the one with her name on the door. Now on the 14th floor of a building on Fifth Avenue that Alessandro had renovated with a partner she had selected, and terms she had negotiated, and a design she had approved on the grounds that warm light was non-negotiable. She stood in the dining room that had once been her Section 4, and looked at the white linen tables, and the expensive wine, and the people in designer suits discussing things that changed the shape of the world. Gerald found her. He looked at her for a long moment. "Romano," he said. "Gerald. You look different." "I'm wearing a better suit." He shook his head. "It's not the suit." A pause. "You looked invisible before, not anymore." She looked at the room. At the table near the far wall table, 7 slightly elevated angled so that whoever sat there could see every entrance and exit. At the man already seated there, who looked up when he felt her attention and held her gaze across the room with the steady total attention she had come to know as simply the way he saw things. "No," she said. "Not anymore." She crossed the room. She sat down at table 7, and Alessandro Moretti, the man who had said, "I want her," to a room full of people who had no idea what that would eventually mean, looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning when she had answered him in Italian in a room full of people who had decided not to hear. Not the way a man looked at something he had acquired, the way a man looked at someone who had arrived. "Finalmente," he said. "Finally." "You always say that," she told him. "You're always worth saying it to." She picked up the menu, the same menu she had carried for 2 years on the other side of this room, and she read it, and she chose, and she handed it back to the server without looking at the price, because she had stopped doing that 3 months after the night she answered a man in Italian in a room full of people who had decided not to hear. She had learned in the year since that night that worth was not something other people assigned. It was something you decided, and Isabella Romano had decided clearly and permanently, and without any need for anyone else to confirm it, that she was worth every room she walked into, every table she sat, at every word she spoke in any of the 3 languages she carried like inheritance from a woman who had taught her that language was architecture, that the most important buildings were the ones built on truth, and that the woman who knew her own value never had to ask permission to take up space. She had never been invisible. She had only been waiting for the room that was worth being seen in. She had found it. She was